Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The Whispering Shadows. Every night, it started the same way. I'd be lying in bed, the weight of the day's exhaustion pressing down on me, when the whispers began. Soft, barely audible at first, they floated up from beneath my bed like tendrils of cold smoke. I tried to ignore them, burying my head under the pillow, but they persisted. Each night, they grew a bit louder, a bit clearer. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Stress from work, maybe. I work as a night shift security guard at an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The place is a relic from the 1920s, a decrepit maze of rusting machinery and broken windows. It's the kind of place where shadows seem to move on their own, and every creak and groan echoes like a distant scream. One night, after a particularly long shift, I decided to stay up and listen. I lay there, eyes wide open, straining to catch every whisper. "Come closer," they said. "We see you." My heart pounded in my chest, a wild, frantic rhythm that drowned out the whispers for a moment. But I couldn't mistake the words. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stared at the ceiling, the whispers replaying in my mind like a broken record. What did they mean? Who were they? I needed answers, but I was too terrified to look under the bed. The fear of what I might find was paralyzing. The next day, I told my best friend Mark about the whispers. Mark and I have known each other since childhood. He's the kind of guy who laughs in the face of danger and never takes anything too seriously. "You're just stressed," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You've been working too hard. Take a break, man." But I knew it was more than that. The whispers felt real, too real to be a figment of my imagination. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to catch the whispers again, maybe even record them. As soon as the lights went out, they started. This time, they were louder. "Help us," they whispered. "Free us." I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and pointed it under the bed. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty floor and a few old boxes. Nothing. No source of the whispers, no sign of anything unusual. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed by a surge of frustration. Was I losing my mind? But then, just as I was about to stand up, I heard it. A single, chilling laugh. It echoed in the silence, sending a shiver down my spine. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The laugh lingered, a haunting reminder of the presence beneath my bed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of my room, clutching a baseball bat, my eyes glued to the bed. When dawn finally broke, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and dread. I needed to find out what was happening, but I was terrified of what I might discover. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Determined to get to the bottom of the whispers, I decided to investigate further. During the day, my room seemed harmless, just a typical bedroom with a slightly cluttered floor and an unmade bed. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. Shadows lengthened, and the air grew thick with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. I bought a small digital recorder, hoping to capture the whispers as proof that I wasn't going insane. That night, I placed the recorder under the bed and turned it on, setting it to record all night long. As I lay there, waiting for the whispers to begin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers came as expected. This time, they were clearer than ever. "Join us," they murmured. "We're waiting." I shivered, clutching the blankets tighter around me. The voice was unmistakably human, yet hollow and distant, as if spoken from the depths of a dark well. I forced myself to stay still, fighting the urge to bolt from the room. Morning couldn't come soon enough. As soon as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I retrieved the recorder. My hands trembled as I played back the recording. For the first few hours, there was nothing but static and the occasional rustle. Then, around midnight, the whispers started. Clear as day, the recorder captured every chilling word. "Join us. We're waiting." I played the recording for Mark later that day. His usual carefree demeanor was replaced with a look of genuine concern. "This is creepy as hell," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "We need to figure out what's going on." We decided to start with the history of my house. It was an old Victorian-style home, built in the late 1800s. Over the years, it had changed hands several times, and the real estate agent hadn't mentioned anything about its history when I bought it. Together, Mark and I headed to the local library to see what we could dig up. The library's archives were a treasure trove of old newspapers, property records, and town histories. We spent hours sifting through yellowed pages and dusty ledgers. Finally, we found something. In the late 1930s, my house had belonged to a family named the Crenshaws. The father, a well-known banker, had been found dead in the house under mysterious circumstances. His wife and 2 children disappeared shortly afterward, never to be seen again. "Do you think their spirits are haunting your house?" Mark asked, his voice a mix of skepticism and intrigue. "It's possible," I replied, my mind racing. "Maybe they're trying to communicate with me." That night, armed with the new information, I decided to confront the whispers. I sat on my bed, recorder in hand, and spoke into the darkness. "Who are you? What do you want?" I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The response was immediate and chilling. "We need your help," the whispers said. "Find the truth. Free us." The next morning, I told Mark about the latest development. He suggested we bring in a paranormal investigator, someone who could help us make sense of the situation. Reluctantly, I agreed. That afternoon, we contacted a local investigator named Claire. She had a reputation for being thorough and professional, with years of experience in dealing with hauntings and supernatural occurrences. Claire arrived at my house that evening, her equipment in tow. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet confidence. After listening to my story and examining the recording, she set up her devices around the house. EMF meters, infrared cameras, and audio recorders were placed strategically to capture any paranormal activity. As night fell, Claire, Mark, and I gathered in my bedroom. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. We sat in silence, waiting for the whispers to begin. It didn't take long. "Help us," they whispered again, sending chills down our spines. Claire's equipment sprang to life, capturing the voices and measuring fluctuations in the electromagnetic field. Claire's face grew pale as she listened to the voices. "There's definitely something here," she said, her voice tight with tension. "Something that needs to be put to rest." We continued to listen, piecing together the fragments of the whispers. They spoke of betrayal, pain, and a hidden secret buried deep within the house. As the night wore on, the whispers grew more urgent, more desperate. "Find the truth," they repeated. "Free us." By dawn, we had a plan. We would search the house from top to bottom, looking for any clues that might explain the haunting. The whispers had given us a mission, and I was determined to see it through. But as we prepared for the search, a sense of dread settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something terrible, something that had been hidden for far too long. The next day, armed with flashlights and determination, we began our search. The house was a labyrinth of rooms and narrow hallways, each one filled with the ghosts of its past. Claire led the way, her EMF meter humming softly as we moved from room to room. We started in the attic, a dusty, cluttered space filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. The whispers had told us to find the truth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was hiding somewhere within these walls. As we sifted through boxes and crates, Claire's meter suddenly spiked. "There's something here," she said, her voice tense with excitement. We followed the readings to an old trunk, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Mark and I pried it open, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a journal. The journal belonged to Amelia Crenshaw, the wife of the banker who had died under mysterious circumstances. I carefully opened the worn pages, the smell of aged paper filling the air. Amelia's journal told a tragic story. Her husband, Charles Crenshaw, had been involved in some shady dealings, and his business partners had turned against him. One night, they had come to the house, demanding repayment. When Charles couldn't produce the money, they had beaten him to death and threatened Amelia and her children. Fearing for their lives, Amelia had hidden her children in the house before fleeing into the night. She never returned, and her children were never found. "Do you think the children's spirits are still here?" Mark asked, his face pale. "Maybe," Claire replied, her eyes scanning the room. "If they died in the house, their spirits could be trapped, unable to move on." Determined to find more clues, we moved our search to the basement. The air grew colder as we descended the stairs, and the shadows seemed to press in around us. The basement was a dark, damp space filled with old tools and forgotten belongings. Claire's EMF meter buzzed louder as we approached a far corner of the room. "There's definitely something here," she said, pointing to a spot on the floor. We knelt down, examining the area closely. The floorboards were loose, and with a bit of effort, we pried them up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, we found a small, tattered blanket and a child's toy, both covered in dust. The sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. "This must be where Amelia hid her children," I whispered, feeling a wave of sadness wash over me. Claire nodded, her face grim. "Their spirits are trapped here, bound to this place by their tragic end. We need to help them move on." That night, we set up a seance in the basement, hoping to communicate with the spirits of the Crenshaw children. The air was thick with tension as we gathered in a circle, holding hands and calling out to the spirits. "We know what happened to you," Claire said, her voice steady. "We want to help you find peace." The room grew colder, and a faint light flickered in the darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "Thank you," they said. "Free us." Claire instructed us to focus our thoughts on freeing the spirits, visualizing them moving onto a place of peace and light. The whispers grew softer, and the room seemed to lighten as if a great weight had been lifted. We stayed like that for what felt like hours until the whispers faded away entirely. When we finally emerged from the basement, exhausted but relieved, I felt a strange sense of calm. The whispers were gone, and the house felt different, lighter somehow. "I think we did it," Mark said, a note of awe in his voice. "I think we helped them move on." But as we prepared to leave, Claire's face remained tense. "I'm not so sure," she said, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. "There's something else here, something we haven't uncovered yet." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The Crenshaw children might have found peace, but the house still held secrets, and I feared we were far from finished with its haunting presence. Despite the apparent calm that settled over the house, Claire's words haunted me. Something else was lurking in the shadows, something we hadn't yet uncovered. I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. Determined to uncover the full truth, we delved deeper into the house's history. We returned to the library, where Claire unearthed more old documents and records. Among them, we found references to another family that had lived in the house after the Crenshaws, the Thompsons. They had moved in shortly after the Crenshaws' disappearance and had abruptly left the house a year later. There were no records of why they left, only a vague mention of unsettling occurrences. Intrigued, we tracked down the descendants of the Thompson family. After some searching, we found Rebecca Thompson, the granddaughter of the original owners. Rebecca was hesitant to talk about the house at first, but when we mentioned the whispers and the Crenshaws, her demeanor changed. "My grandparents never spoke much about their time in that house," she said, her voice trembling. "But I remember them saying it was cursed." According to Rebecca, her grandparents had experienced strange phenomena similar to what I had described: the whispers, the cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Her grandmother, in particular, had been tormented by vivid nightmares and a growing sense of dread. They had fled the house in the middle of the night, leaving behind most of their belongings. Rebecca also mentioned that her grandmother had kept a diary during their time in the house. After some persuasion, she agreed to lend it to us. The diary was a chilling account of their year in the house, filled with descriptions of ghostly apparitions and disturbing events. It confirmed what we already knew, that the house was haunted by more than just the spirits of the Crenshaw children. As we read through the diary, one entry stood out. It mentioned a hidden room in the basement, a place where her grandmother had felt an overwhelming sense of evil. "We must find that room," Claire said, her eyes alight with determination. "Whatever is causing this, it's hidden there." We returned to the basement, our nerves on edge. The air grew colder as we approached the far corner, the same place where we had found the hidden compartment. Claire's EMF meter buzzed wildly, confirming our suspicions. We searched the walls, tapping and prodding until we found a loose panel. With a collective effort, we pried it open, revealing a narrow passageway. The passageway led to a small, hidden room. The air inside was thick and oppressive, and a sense of dread washed over us. In the center of the room stood an old, wooden chair, and on the floor around it were strange symbols drawn in chalk. The walls were covered in faded, almost illegible writing. It felt as though the room itself was alive with a malevolent energy. Claire set up her equipment, and we began our investigation. The EMF meter spiked erratically, and the temperature dropped several degrees. As we stood there, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. "Get out," they hissed. "Leave this place." Ignoring the warning, Claire focused on the symbols on the floor. "These are protective symbols," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone was trying to contain something here." Suddenly, the room grew darker, and a cold wind swept through the passageway. The whispers turned into anguished cries, and we felt an overwhelming presence pressing down on us. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice shaking with fear. Just as we turned to go, a chilling laugh echoed through the room, the same laugh I had heard on the first night. It was closer now, more menacing. "You can't escape," it taunted. "We are always here." We bolted from the room, hearts pounding, and didn't stop until we were back in the main part of the house. As we caught our breath, Claire looked at us, her face pale. "This isn't just a haunting," she said. "There's something evil in that room. Something that was never meant to be released." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. We had uncovered the hidden room, but in doing so, we had unleashed something far more terrifying than we had ever imagined. The whispers, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched, it all made sense now. We were dealing with a malevolent force that had been trapped in the house for decades. With the hidden room discovered and the malevolent force unleashed, our resolve was tested to its limits. We knew we couldn't leave things as they were. The entity within the house was powerful and dangerous, and it was clear we had to find a way to banish it for good. Claire contacted a colleague of hers, an experienced exorcist named Father Michael. He agreed to come to the house, intrigued and concerned by our story. Father Michael arrived the following evening, bringing with him an assortment of holy relics, prayer books, and candles. He was a tall, imposing figure with a calm demeanor that belied the gravity of the situation. After listening to our account and examining the hidden room, he confirmed our worst fears. "This is the work of a dark spirit," he said. "Something that feeds on fear and suffering. We must proceed with great caution." The exorcism was scheduled for midnight, the time when the spirit's power would be at its peak. As the hour approached, we gathered in the basement, our nerves on edge. Father Michael began setting up, placing candles in a circle around the room and sprinkling holy water on the floor. The air grew thick with anticipation, and the temperature plummeted, a sure sign that the spirit was aware of our intentions. As Father Michael began the exorcism, chanting prayers in Latin, the atmosphere grew even colder. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. "Leave us," they hissed. "You have no power here." Suddenly, the hidden room's door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The force of it sent a shockwave through the basement, knocking us off balance. Father Michael continued his prayers, his voice unwavering despite the chaos. The spirit's presence grew stronger, a palpable force pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. Then, the laughter returned, cold, mocking, and filled with malice. "You cannot defeat me," it taunted. "I am eternal." Father Michael stood firm, raising a crucifix and chanting louder. The room seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, and the air was filled with a sense of impending doom. The whispers turned into screams, and the temperature dropped even further, our breath visible in the frigid air. "By the power of Christ, I command you to leave this place," Father Michael intoned, his voice filled with authority. The spirit's resistance was fierce, but the priest's resolve was unyielding. He continued to chant, moving around the room and splashing holy water on the walls. The spirit's screams grew louder, echoing through the house like a chorus of tormented souls. Objects in the room began to shake and rattle, and the oppressive weight of the spirit's presence made it feel as though the walls were closing in on us. But slowly, the power of Father Michael's exorcism began to take effect. The temperature started to rise, and the oppressive force began to lift. The candle's flames grew steady, and the whispers faded to a barely audible murmur. The spirit's resistance weakened, and for a moment, there was a tense, almost tangible silence. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. The spirit's final, desperate attempt to reclaim its power sent chills down my spine. But Father Michael stood his ground, raising his voice in a final, powerful prayer. "Begone, foul spirit. Return to the darkness from whence you came." With a final, blood-curdling scream, the spirit's presence vanished. The oppressive weight lifted completely, and the room returned to its normal temperature. We stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just transpired sinking in. The hidden room felt different now, empty, devoid of the malevolent energy that had once filled it. Father Michael turned to us, his face pale but determined. "It is done," he said quietly. "The spirit is banished." Relief washed over us, but it was tempered by exhaustion and a lingering sense of unease. The house was free of the dark spirit, but the events of the past few days had left an indelible mark on us all. As we climbed the stairs, leaving the basement behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't entirely over. The exorcism had banished the dark spirit, but the house was far from peaceful. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted, yet an uneasy stillness pervaded every room. Mark and Claire departed, exhausted but satisfied with our efforts, leaving me alone to confront the lingering shadows of our ordeal. Days passed, and I tried to return to my normal routine. But the house felt different now. It was as if the walls held their breath, waiting for something unseen. I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched, and every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down my spine. Sleep was elusive, and when I did manage to drift off, my dreams were haunted by visions of the hidden room and the dark spirit. One night, as I lay in bed struggling to fall asleep, I heard it again, the chilling laugh that had haunted me since the first night. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to listen. The laugh echoed through the darkness, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept through the house, determined to find the source. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty rooms and shadowed corners. The laugh continued, growing louder and more menacing. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sinister presence that taunted me from the shadows. Desperate for answers, I returned to the basement, flashlight in hand. The hidden room's door stood open, the symbols on the floor faded but still visible. The air was cold and heavy, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The laugh echoed again, closer this time, and I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. Fear gripped me as I realized the spirit had not been fully banished. It had lingered, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. My mind raced, searching for a solution. Father Michael had done all he could, but it was clear that something more was needed. The following morning, I reached out to Claire, explaining the resurgence of the malevolent presence. She listened intently, her concern evident. "There may be another way," she said. "A ritual that could permanently seal the spirit away, but it's dangerous." We'll need to gather specific items and perform it precisely at midnight. We gathered the necessary items: black candles, purified salt, and a rare herb known for its protective properties. Claire walked me through the ritual, explaining each step in detail. We would need to draw a protective circle in the hidden room, light the candles at the exact moment, and chant an ancient incantation to bind the spirit and seal it away. As midnight approached, we prepared for the ritual. The hidden room was eerily silent, the oppressive weight of the spirit's presence palpable. We drew the circle, placed the candles, and sprinkled the salt, following Claire's instructions to the letter. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. With everything in place, we began the incantation. The words felt strange and foreign on my tongue, but I repeated them with determination. The spirit's laugh echoed through the room, louder and more menacing than ever. The candles flickered wildly, and a chill wind swept through the space, threatening to extinguish the flames. We continued the chant, our voices growing louder and more insistent. The spirit's presence surged, a dark force pressing down on us with malevolent intent. It felt as though the very air around us was alive with anger and hatred. But we held our ground, determined to see the ritual through. As we reached the final words of the incantation, the room seemed to explode with energy. The candles flared brightly, and the oppressive force lifted, replaced by a sense of stillness. The spirit's laugh faded, replaced by a deafening silence. We stood there, breathless and exhausted, waiting for any sign that the ritual had worked. The room remained silent, the air no longer heavy with the spirit's presence. A sense of peace settled over us, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly safe. We had done it. The spirit was sealed away, bound by the ritual's power. The house felt lighter, the shadows no longer menacing. But as we left the basement, a lingering doubt gnawed at the back of my mind. Had we truly banished the spirit for good? Or had we merely pushed it deeper into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return? Life gradually returned to normal in the days following the ritual. The house felt lighter, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, I could sleep soundly through the night. Mark and Claire visited often, checking in to make sure everything was still peaceful. For a while, it seemed like we had succeeded. But then, a week later, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they sent chills down my spine. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Yet, deep down, I knew something was wrong. The spirit wasn't gone, it had merely retreated, biding its time. One night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Come back," they called. "You can't escape us." I woke in a cold sweat, the familiar feeling of dread settling over me. Desperate for answers, I contacted Claire and Mark, urging them to return to the house. We gathered in the living room, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. "The spirit is still here," I said, my voice trembling. "The ritual didn't work." Claire nodded, her face serious. "I feared this might happen. The spirit is stronger than we anticipated. We need to find another way to banish it permanently." Determined to uncover the truth, we delved deeper into the house's history. We searched through old records, newspaper clippings, and any documents we could find. Finally, we stumbled upon an old diary belonging to the house's original owner, a man named Jonathan Hawthorne. His entries revealed a dark secret: the house had been built on cursed land, a site of ancient rituals and bloodshed. Jonathan tried to contain the curse, Claire said, reading aloud from the diary. He performed rituals to keep the dark forces at bay, but it was never enough. The curse is tied to the land itself. Realizing the gravity of our situation, we knew we had to perform a more powerful ritual, one that would cleanse the land and banish the spirit forever. Claire reached out to a renowned occultist, Professor Helena Moore, who agreed to help us. She arrived the next day, bringing with her an array of ancient texts and rare artifacts. Professor Moore was a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude. She studied the diary and the history of the land, formulating a plan to break the curse. "We will need to perform a cleansing ritual at the exact site where the original rituals took place," she explained. It will be dangerous, but it's our only hope. We prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary items and setting up a circle in the backyard, where the ancient rituals had been performed. As the sun set, a sense of foreboding settled over us. We knew we were about to face the full wrath of the spirit. At midnight, we began the ritual. Professor Moore chanted in a language none of us understood, her voice strong and unwavering. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. "You cannot break the curse," they taunted. "You are doomed." We held our ground, determined to see the ritual through. The candles flickered, and a chill wind swept through the yard, carrying with it the scent of decay. Professor Moore's chanting grew louder, more urgent, as the spirit's presence intensified. Shadows danced around us, and the air crackled with energy. Suddenly, the ground split open, revealing a dark, gaping void. From within, a swirling mass of shadows emerged, the embodiment of the curse. It loomed over us, a malevolent force that radiated hatred and despair. "Leave this place," it roared. "You do not belong here." Professor Moore stood her ground, raising a talisman and chanting even louder. The spirit shrieked, its form writhing and contorting as the power of the ritual took hold. The ground shook, and a blinding light erupted from the talisman, enveloping the spirit. For a moment, everything was chaos. The air was filled with screams, and the ground bucked beneath our feet. But slowly, the light began to absorb the darkness, drawing the spirit back into the void. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence. The ground sealed itself, and the light dimmed, leaving us standing in the aftermath of the battle. We stood in stunned silence, the weight of what we had just experienced settling over us. The air was still, the oppressive presence gone. Professor Moore lowered the talisman, her face pale but triumphant. "The curse is broken," she said quietly. "The spirit is banished." Relief washed over us, but a lingering doubt remained. We had faced the spirit and survived, but the scars of the encounter would stay with us forever. As we stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy after the final ritual. The house felt different, lighter, almost peaceful. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long was gone, and I could finally breathe easy. Professor Moore assured us that the curse was broken and the spirit banished. Yet, despite her assurances, a small part of me remained wary, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Days turned into weeks, and the house remained quiet. I started to believe that the nightmare was truly over. But one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, a familiar sound jolted me awake. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the chilling laugh that had haunted me since the beginning. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to listen. The laugh echoed through the darkness, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept through the house, my nerves on edge. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty rooms and shadowed corners. The laugh continued, growing louder and more menacing. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sinister presence taunting me from the shadows. Desperate and terrified, I called Claire and Mark, urging them to come over. They arrived quickly, their faces etched with concern. "I heard it again," I said, my voice trembling. "The laugh. It's back." "We need to check the hidden room," Claire said, her eyes filled with determination. "If the spirit is still here, that's where it will be." We descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The hidden room's door stood ajar, the symbols on the floor faint but still visible. The atmosphere was thick with dread, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. We stepped inside, our breath visible in the frigid air. The laugh echoed again, closer this time, and I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. Suddenly, the hidden room's door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The force of it sent a shockwave through the room, knocking us off balance. The laugh grew louder, a mocking, malevolent sound that seemed to come from the very walls. "You cannot escape," it taunted. "You belong to us." Fear gripped us as we realized the spirit had never truly left. It had retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike. We needed to find a way to banish it once and for all, but without Professor Moore, we were on our own. Claire's face was pale, her hands trembling. "We have to finish this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to break the curse for good." We gathered in a circle, holding hands and focusing our thoughts on banishing the spirit. Claire began to chant the incantation, her voice strong and unwavering. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. The spirit's presence surged, a dark force pressing down on us with malevolent intent. The candles flickered wildly, and a chill wind swept through the room, carrying with it the scent of decay. The laugh grew louder, echoing through the space like a chorus of tormented souls. Objects began to shake and rattle, and the oppressive weight of the spirit's presence made it feel as though the walls were closing in on us. But we held our ground, determined to see the ritual through. As Claire's chant grew louder, the spirit's resistance intensified. The shadows writhed and contorted, a dark mass of anger and hatred. But slowly, the power of the incantation began to take effect. The spirit's laugh turned to screams, and the oppressive force began to lift. The temperature started to rise, and the oppressive weight began to ease. The candle's flames grew steady, and the shadows began to recede. The spirit's presence weakened, and for a moment, there was a tense, almost tangible silence. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. The spirit's final, desperate attempt to reclaim its power sent chills down my spine. But Claire stood her ground, raising her voice in a final, powerful chant. "Begone, foul spirit. Return to the darkness from whence you came." With a final, blood-curdling scream, the spirit's presence vanished. The oppressive weight lifted completely, and the room returned to its normal temperature. We stood in stunned silence, the reality of what had just transpired sinking in. The hidden room felt different now, empty, devoid of the malevolent energy that had once filled it. We emerged from the basement, exhausted but relieved. The house was finally free of the dark spirit, and a sense of peace settled over us. As we stood in the living room, catching our breath, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The spirit was gone, but the house still held its secrets, and I knew we would never forget the horrors we had faced. The ordeal had changed us all. We had faced a malevolent force and survived, but the scars of the encounter would stay with us forever. As I looked around the room at my friends, I realized that our bond had been strengthened by the experience. We had faced the darkness together, and together, we had emerged victorious. But as we left the house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. The whispering shadows had been banished, but the echoes of their presence would haunt us for the rest of our lives. End of Story 1. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. Damned Reflections. There's something strange about the old house my family just moved into. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it feels like the walls whisper secrets at night, and the air is thick with a chilling unease. My name is Sarah, and I'm 16. My parents thought moving to this secluded, Victorian-era house in the countryside would be a fresh start for us after the tumultuous year we had in the city. But this house has a different plan. The first night was uneventful. Exhausted from unpacking, I collapsed onto my bed and drifted into a dreamless sleep. It was the next morning when I first noticed something odd. As I brushed my teeth, I glanced at the antique mirror hanging in the bathroom. My reflection seemed off. It wasn't just the early morning grogginess. No, my reflection wore a twisted, mocking smile while I stood expressionless. "Mom?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. She appeared at the bathroom door, wiping her hands on a dish rack. "Do you notice anything weird about this mirror?" She glanced at it, then back at me with a puzzled expression. "It looks fine to me, honey. Maybe you're just tired. Give it some time, you'll adjust to the new environment." I nodded, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But as the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent. Every time I looked in the mirror, my reflection seemed to have a mind of its own. It mimicked me perfectly at times, but other times, it would smirk or move its eyes independently. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was horribly wrong. One evening, after dinner, I decided to confront the mirror. I stood before it in my room, staring intently at my own face. "What do you want?" I whispered, feeling foolish but desperate. For a moment, my reflection did nothing out of the ordinary. Then, slowly, that sinister smile crept across its face again, and my heart pounded in my chest. I tried to look away, but my eyes wouldn't budge. It felt as though an invisible force held me captive. The smile grew wider, more grotesque, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine. My reflection raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and I felt an icy chill spread through my own palm. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. My reflection's mouth moved, but no sound came out. I saw my own lips forming words, but I couldn't hear them. Panic surged through me. I slammed my hand against the mirror, trying to break free, but it was as if the glass had become a barrier I couldn't breach. My mother's voice called out from downstairs, snapping me out of my trance. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards falling around me. Breathing heavily, I stumbled back, looking at the broken pieces on the floor. Each fragment still showed my twisted reflection, all smirking up at me in unison. I knew then that this wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something sinister was trapped in the mirror, and it had its eyes set on me. The days following the mirror incident were a blur of fear and confusion. My parents noticed my unease but attributed it to the stress of moving and adjusting to a new place. I didn't dare tell them the full extent of what I was experiencing. They'd think I was losing my mind. Instead, I threw myself into schoolwork and tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was watching me. One evening, while I was studying in my room, I heard a faint, whispering sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from the remnants of the shattered mirror. Curiosity and dread battled within me, but I couldn't resist. I knelt beside the fragments and listened closely. The whispers were incoherent at first, a jumbled mess of sounds that sent shivers down my spine. Then, a single word stood out among the chaos: "Help." My heart raced. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The whispers intensified, the voices overlapping in a desperate plea. "Help us." I recoiled, fear gripping me. What could I possibly do to help whatever was trapped in the mirror? I needed answers, but I didn't know where to start. The library in town seemed like a good place to begin, so the next day, I skipped school and headed there. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, greeted me warmly. "How can I help you, dear?" I hesitated, unsure how to phrase my bizarre request. "I'm looking for information on haunted mirrors or supernatural occurrences." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded and led me to a dusty section of the library filled with old, leather-bound books. "These should have what you're looking for. Be careful, though. Some things are better left unexplored." I spent hours poring over the ancient texts, each page revealing more about the dark history of mirrors and their connection to the spirit world. One book, in particular, caught my eye. It was titled Reflections of the Damned. The author described cases of people being trapped in mirrors, their souls ensnared by a malevolent force. According to the book, mirrors could act as portals to another realm, a place where lost souls roamed, seeking escape. The only way to free them was to confront the entity holding them captive. My blood ran cold as I realized I had to face whatever was haunting me head-on. That night, armed with newfound knowledge, I stood before the remnants of the mirror again. "I'm here to help," I said, my voice trembling. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Free us." I took a deep breath and pressed my hand against one of the larger shards. Instantly, I was pulled into a whirlwind of darkness and cold, my body feeling like it was being torn apart. When the whirlwind subsided, I found myself in a dimly lit, shadowy version of my own room. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and the walls seemed to close in on me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see my twisted reflection, but instead, I saw a figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure hissed, its voice a chilling echo that reverberated through the room. I backed away, my heart pounding. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "I am the keeper of the souls. You cannot free them, and now, you are mine." Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was trapped in this nightmarish realm, with no way out and a malevolent entity determined to claim my soul. I had to find a way to escape and free the souls trapped here before it was too late. My pulse raced as the dark figure loomed closer, its glowing eyes fixated on me. The oppressive silence of the shadowy room pressed in from all sides. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice an icy whisper. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. I took a step back, trying to gather my thoughts. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure's eyes narrowed, and it seemed to smile, a cold, malevolent grin. "I feed on fear and despair. The souls trapped here sustain me. Your intrusion is an unexpected delight." Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't allow myself to become another captive soul. I had to think quickly. "What if I could offer you something else?" I asked, grasping at straws. The figure paused, its expression curious. "What could you possibly offer that is more valuable than the souls I possess?" I racked my brain for an answer, remembering the lore I had read. "Information," I said, hoping to buy time. "I can find others like me, people who can see you. I can bring them here, but only if you let me go." The figure's eyes gleamed with interest. "A tempting offer. But how do I know you won't simply escape and never return?" "I swear I'll come back," I lied, my voice as convincing as I could make it. The figure seemed to consider this, its form flickering slightly. "Very well," it said finally. "But if you fail to return, I will find you, and your punishment will be far worse." With a sudden rush of cold air, the room shifted. I found myself back in my own room, gasping for breath. The broken shards of the mirror lay at my feet, and the whispers had ceased. I knew I had to act quickly. The entity might believe my lie, but it wouldn't be long before it grew suspicious. I decided to confide in my best friend, Alex. He was skeptical at first, but the urgency in my voice convinced him to come over. As I recounted my experiences, his eyes widened in disbelief. "This sounds insane, Sarah. Are you sure you're not just imagining things?" "I wish I were," I replied, showing him the fragments of the mirror. "But I need your help. There's something in the mirror, and it's trapped souls. We have to find a way to free them." Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, let's say I believe you. What do we do next?" I handed him the book I'd found in the library. This book mentions a ritual to confront the entity and free the souls. We need to gather the materials and perform it tonight. We spent the rest of the day gathering the necessary items, candles, salt, and a mirror. By nightfall, we were ready. We set up the ritual in my room, drawing a circle of salt and placing the candles around it. The new mirror stood in the center. I took a deep breath, holding Alex's hand for support. "Let's do this." We lit the candles and began the incantation from the book. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to dance with a life of their own. As we chanted, the mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. Suddenly, the figure appeared in the mirror, its eyes blazing with anger. "You dare to defy me?" it roared, its voice shaking the room. I gripped Alex's hand tighter, forcing myself to continue the chant. The figure's form wavered, and I could see faces of trapped souls pressing against the glass, their eyes pleading. With a final shout, we completed the ritual. The mirror shattered, and a blinding light filled the room. When it faded, the shards lay still, and the oppressive feeling lifted. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. "We did it," I whispered, tears of relief streaming down my face. But as Alex helped me up, I noticed a faint reflection in one of the shards. The dark figure's eyes stared back at me, filled with rage. I knew then that this battle was far from over. The entity was still out there, waiting for its chance to strike again. For a few days, things seemed almost normal. I went back to school, trying to push the horrifying experience to the back of my mind. Alex checked in on me constantly, and we both hoped the ritual had worked. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I glanced at the small, handheld mirror on my dresser. It was just an ordinary mirror, but I couldn't help feeling a chill run down my spine. I turned it face down, not wanting to see my reflection. Sleep came fitfully, filled with restless dreams and shadowy figures. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I sat up in bed, the whispers grew louder. They were coming from the turned-down mirror. My heart pounded as I reached for it, my hand trembling. I flipped it over and saw the same dark figure staring back at me, its eyes burning with fury. "You broke the mirror," it hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "But you cannot break me. I will have your soul, Sarah." I dropped the mirror, and it shattered on the floor. The whispers stopped, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the entity found another way to reach me. The next day, I told Alex what had happened. His face paled, but he nodded resolutely. "We need more help," he said. "There has to be someone who knows how to deal with this." We decided to visit a renowned psychic in town, Mrs. Hawthorne, known for her expertise in dealing with the supernatural. Mrs. Hawthorne's house was an old, ivy-covered mansion that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. She welcomed us in, her piercing blue eyes seeming to see right through us. "I've been expecting you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The darkness that follows you is strong. Come, sit." We explained everything, from the twisted reflection to the ritual. She listened intently, nodding occasionally. "The entity you're dealing with is ancient and powerful," she said. "It feeds on fear and despair, and it won't let go easily. But there is a way to banish it for good." She led us to a dimly lit room filled with crystals, candles, and strange artifacts. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror. "This mirror is a portal," she explained. "We will use it to confront the entity directly. You must face your fears and show it that you are not afraid." I felt a lump in my throat but nodded. "What do we need to do?" Mrs. Hawthorne handed us each a crystal and instructed us to hold them tightly. She began to chant in a language I didn't understand, and the air grew thick with energy. The mirror's surface began to ripple, much like the one in my room had. The dark figure appeared, its eyes glowing with malice. "You think you can banish me?" it snarled. Mrs. Hawthorne continued her chant, her voice steady and unwavering. The entity's form flickered, and it let out a deafening roar. "You will pay for this." I focused on the crystal in my hand, trying to channel all my fear and anger into it. "You don't control me," I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. "I'm not afraid of you." The figure recoiled, its form becoming less distinct. Mrs. Hawthorne's chanting grew louder, and the mirror began to glow. With a final, ear-splitting scream, the entity was sucked into the mirror, and the surface solidified, leaving only our reflections behind. I fell to my knees, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice gentle. "You faced your fear and won." But as I looked at my reflection, a flicker of doubt crept in. For a brief moment, I saw that twisted smile again, mocking me. I knew then that the battle might be over, but the war was far from won. The darkness was still out there, waiting for its chance to return. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that the worst was behind me. The house felt lighter, and I no longer woke up in the middle of the night to whispers. Alex and I resumed our normal routines, but a lingering fear gnawed at the edges of my mind. Mrs. Hawthorne had warned us that the entity was ancient and powerful, and part of me feared it would find a way back. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alex and I decided to visit the old archives in town. I wanted to learn more about the history of our house and any previous inhabitants who might have encountered the entity. The archives were housed in a decrepit, stone building that looked as old as time itself. Inside, the smell of musty books and aged paper filled the air. We spent hours combing through dusty records and forgotten tomes. Just as I was about to give up, Alex called me over, holding an old newspaper clipping. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the headline. It read, "Family vanishes without a trace, local authorities baffled." The article was dated over a century ago and detailed the mysterious disappearance of a family who had lived in our house. According to the report, the family had been troubled by strange occurrences, much like what I had experienced. The parents and their 2 children were last seen by neighbors a week before they vanished. Their belongings were left untouched, and there were no signs of struggle. The only clue was a shattered mirror found in the master bedroom. A chill ran down my spine as I read the article. "Do you think they were trapped by the same entity?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, his face grim. "It's possible. We need to find out more about this mirror and the entity." Our search led us to an old journal belonging to the father of the vanished family. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was legible. The entries detailed the father's growing fear and desperation as the entity's presence became more pronounced. He described seeing twisted reflections and hearing whispers that grew louder each night. The last entry was particularly chilling. "The mirror is a curse. It feeds on our fear. If anyone reads this, beware. Do not let it consume you." I closed the journal, feeling a sense of dread. "We have to go back to Mrs. Hawthorne," I said. "She might know more about this curse." Alex agreed, and we hurried to her house, hoping she could provide answers. Mrs. Hawthorne welcomed us in, her expression serious as we explained what we had found. "The mirror is indeed cursed," she said. "It was created by a powerful sorcerer centuries ago to trap and feed on souls. The entity you encountered is its guardian, and it will stop at nothing to reclaim the mirror and its victims." She led us to her study, where an ancient, leather-bound book lay open on her desk. "There's one way to destroy the mirror and banish the entity for good," she explained. "But it is dangerous. You must confront the entity in its own realm and shatter its connection to our world." My heart sank. The thought of facing the entity again terrified me, but I knew we had no choice. "What do we need to do?" I asked. Mrs. Hawthorne handed us each a vial of thick, black liquid. "This potion will allow you to enter the entity's realm. Once there, you must find its heart and destroy it." That night, Alex and I prepared for the journey. We drank the potion, and the world around us dissolved into darkness. We found ourselves in a twisted version of my house, the air heavy with malevolence. Shadows flitted along the walls, and the whispers began anew, louder and more insistent. We made our way to the basement, where the whispers seemed to converge. The door creaked open, revealing a chamber filled with mirrors. In the center stood the entity, its form shifting and flickering. "You dare to return," it snarled. Fear gripped me, but I pushed it aside. "We're here to end this," I said, my voice steady. The entity laughed, a sound that chilled my very soul. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed. "I am eternal." Alex and I exchanged a determined look. "We'll see about that," he said, raising the hammer we had brought. Together, we charged at the entity, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The entity's laughter echoed ominously through the chamber as we approached it. The air grew colder with every step, and the mirrors lining the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. "Stay close," I whispered to Alex, gripping the hammer tightly. We had to be brave, even if our fear threatened to overwhelm us. The entity's form shifted and solidified, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. "You will not leave here alive," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the room. Without warning, it lunged at us. I swung the hammer, barely grazing its shadowy form. The entity recoiled, and I saw an opening. "Now, Alex!" I shouted. He charged forward, smashing one of the mirrors with his own hammer. The mirror shattered, and the entity let out a blood-curdling scream. The air around us seemed to vibrate with its pain. "Keep going." Mrs. Hawthorne had said the mirrors were the key to the entity's power. Destroying them would weaken it. We moved in unison, shattering mirrors left and right. Each time a mirror broke, the entity's form flickered and grew weaker. But with every swing, it fought back harder, sending waves of cold and darkness crashing over us. My muscles ached, and my breaths came in ragged gasps, but I refused to give up. Finally, we stood before the last mirror. The entity's eyes blazed with desperation and fury. "You think you can defeat me?" it roared, its voice shaking the room. I hesitated, the weight of our task pressing down on me. What if this didn't work? What if we were trapped here forever? "Do it, Sarah," Alex urged, his voice steady. "We have to end this." Taking a deep breath, I raised the hammer and brought it down with all my strength. The mirror shattered, and the entity let out an unearthly wail. The darkness around us exploded in a blinding light, and I felt myself being pulled away, back to the real world. I awoke on the floor of my room, gasping for air. Alex lay beside me, his face pale but alive. "We did it," he murmured, his voice weak. I looked around, half expecting the entity to reappear, but the room was still. The mirrors were gone, replaced by shards of glass that glimmered harmlessly. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. The battle might be over, but the war wasn't won yet. Mrs. Hawthorne had said destroying the mirrors would weaken the entity, but what if it wasn't enough? The next morning, we returned to Mrs. Hawthorne's house, hoping for guidance. She greeted us with a relieved smile. "You've done well," she said. "The entity's hold on this world has been broken, but it's not gone. It's weakened, but it will return unless we find a way to destroy it completely." "How?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What more can we do?" Mrs. Hawthorne led us to her study and opened a hidden compartment in her desk. Inside was an old, ornate dagger, its blade etched with ancient symbols. "This dagger was forged to vanquish entities like the one you faced," she explained. "You must find the entity's heart and pierce it with this. Only then will it be destroyed for good." I took the dagger, its weight heavy in my hand. The thought of facing the entity again terrified me, but I knew we had no choice. "Where do we find its heart?" Alex asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Mrs. Hawthorne pointed to the center of the room. "In the heart of the mirror maze, where you last confronted it. The entity's heart is hidden there. You must return and finish what you started." That night, armed with the dagger, Alex and I prepared to enter the entity's realm once more. We drank the potion, and the world dissolved into darkness. We found ourselves back in the twisted version of my house, the air thick with malevolence. We made our way to the basement, where the shattered mirrors lay. In the center of the room, a pulsating, shadowy mass awaited us. The entity's heart. As we approached, the darkness around us seemed to come alive, whispering threats and promises of eternal torment. I raised the dagger, my hands shaking. "We can do this," Alex said, squeezing my shoulder. "We have to." With a deep breath, I plunged the dagger into the heart. The entity let out a final, ear-piercing scream, and the darkness exploded in a blinding light. When it faded, the room was still. The mirrors were gone, and the oppressive feeling had lifted. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. We had done it. The entity was destroyed, and its curse was broken. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, waiting for its chance to return. In the days following our final confrontation with the entity, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house was gone, replaced by a lightness I had almost forgotten. Mrs. Hawthorne assured us that the entity was truly vanquished, and Alex and I tried to move on with our lives. Yet, the sense of unease lingered, like a shadow that refused to fully dissipate. One evening, while I was cleaning out my room, I found a small, forgotten mirror tucked away in the back of my closet. It was an old, handheld mirror, the kind with an ornate silver handle. I froze, my heart pounding. Hadn't we destroyed all the mirrors connected to the entity? I hesitated, then picked it up, my fingers trembling. For a moment, my reflection stared back at me normally, but then, just as I was about to put it down, the image twisted into that familiar, mocking smile. I dropped the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The twisted reflection had returned. I grabbed my phone and called Alex, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. He arrived within minutes, his face pale but determined. "We need to get rid of it," he said, picking up the mirror with a cloth. "Maybe it's just a leftover shard of the entity's power." We wrapped the mirror in several layers of cloth and took it to Mrs. Hawthorne's house. She examined the mirror, her brow furrowed. "This is not just a remnant," she said slowly. "The entity's power still lingers here, but it's different. We might have destroyed its heart, but it seems a part of it survived, trying to find a new host." Fear gripped me. "What do we do now?" I asked, feeling the weight of despair returning. Mrs. Hawthorne looked thoughtful, then nodded decisively. "We need to perform one final ritual to cleanse this mirror and any residual energy left behind." That night, we gathered once more in Mrs. Hawthorne's ritual room. The air was thick with tension as we set up the candles and drew a circle of salt around the mirror. Mrs. Hawthorne handed us each a small vial of blue liquid. "Drink this," she instructed. "It will protect you from the entity's power during the ritual." As we drank, she began chanting, the ancient words resonating through the room. The mirror's surface started to ripple, and the temperature dropped sharply. The twisted reflection reappeared, its eyes burning with malevolence. "You cannot escape me," it hissed, its voice echoing in the small room. We continued the chant, our voices steady despite the growing fear. The reflection's form flickered, and I could see the darkness behind it, writhing and pulsing. Mrs. Hawthorne's chant grew louder, and the air around us seemed to vibrate with power. The reflection screamed, a sound that made my blood run cold, and then it shattered, the mirror exploding into 1,000 pieces. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifted. We stared at the shattered glass, breathing heavily. "It's over," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice filled with relief. "The entity is truly gone this time." Alex and I helped clean up the shards, our hands shaking but our spirits lighter. As we left Mrs. Hawthorne's house, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. We had faced the darkness and won. In the following weeks, life returned to normal. The house no longer felt haunted, and the nightmares stopped. Alex and I grew closer, bonded by our shared ordeal. Mrs. Hawthorne remained a comforting presence, always there if we needed her. Yet, as winter turned to spring, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was a faint, almost imperceptible sensation, but it was there. One evening, as I passed by a shop window, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. For a split second, it wore that twisted smile. I froze, my heart racing. The reflection was normal again, but the brief glimpse had left me shaken. I hurried home, my mind racing. Had we truly destroyed the entity, or had it found another way to linger? That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The peace I had felt was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear. What if the entity was still out there, biding its time? As I drifted off to sleep, I knew one thing for certain: our battle with the darkness was not over. The entity might be weakened, but it wasn't defeated. It was waiting, and sooner or later, it would return. The sense of unease grew stronger with each passing day. I tried to convince myself that the glimpse of the twisted smile in the shop window had been a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. The entity was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. One night, I awoke to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I recognized the familiar, chilling voices. They were coming from my vanity mirror, which I had avoided since our last encounter. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it, the whispers growing louder. "Sarah," the voices called, their tone both mocking and pleading. "You cannot escape us." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I had to do something. I couldn't let the entity regain its power. Desperation drove me to call Alex and Mrs. Hawthorne, asking them to come over immediately. Within an hour, they arrived, their faces grim but determined. "We need to end this once and for all," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice steady. "We must confront the entity and destroy its source of power." She explained that while we had weakened the entity, we hadn't fully eradicated its presence. Its essence still lingered, waiting to reclaim a foothold in our world. We gathered in the basement, where the entity's power felt strongest. Mrs. Hawthorne had brought an array of ritual tools, including the ancient dagger we had used before. She drew a large circle on the floor with salt and positioned candles at each point. In the center, she placed the vanity mirror. "Stand within the circle," she instructed. "We need to combine our strength to banish the entity completely." As we took our positions, she began chanting in the same ancient language as before. The air grew heavy, and the shadows around us seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing. The mirror's surface rippled, and the entity's face appeared, its eyes burning with a fierce hatred. "You think you can defeat me?" it snarled, its voice shaking the room. Mrs. Hawthorne continued chanting, her voice unwavering. Alex and I joined in, our voices merging with hers in a powerful harmony. The entity's form flickered, and it let out a deafening roar. The room seemed to vibrate with its fury, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. The mirror cracked, and I saw faces of trapped souls pressing against the glass, their eyes pleading for release. With a final, desperate scream, the entity lunged at us, but it was too late. The mirror shattered, and the entity's form dissolved into nothingness. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifted. We stood there, breathing heavily, the shattered pieces of the mirror glimmering at our feet. "It's over," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice filled with relief. "The entity is gone. Truly gone this time." Alex and I exchanged a look of disbelief and triumph. We had done it. We had finally defeated the darkness that had haunted us for so long. In the days that followed, the house felt lighter, almost welcoming. The whispers were gone, and the mirrors no longer held any sinister reflections. Life began to return to normal, and the fear that had gripped us slowly faded. But one evening, as I was walking home from school, I caught a glimpse of a familiar face in a puddle. The twisted smile, the mocking eyes. I froze, my heart pounding. It was gone in an instant, replaced by my own reflection, but the brief glimpse left me shaken. I hurried home, my mind racing. I had to tell Alex and Mrs. Hawthorne. We couldn't let our guard down, not even for a moment. The entity might be defeated, but its echoes lingered, waiting for a chance to return. We had to stay vigilant, ready to confront the darkness if it ever tried to rise again. As I sat in my room that night, I stared at the empty space where the vanity mirror had once been. The battle was over, but the war against the darkness was never truly won. It was a constant, silent struggle, one that required unwavering courage and vigilance. And as long as I lived, I would be ready to face it. The end. Subscribe for more scary stories. Thanks for watching.